and welcome to this first lecture in a new 10-week lecture series on the political economy of education in times of conflict, crisis and pandemic. This lecture series is co-organized by the Centre for International Education at the University of Sussex, the peer network, which is made up of the universities of Cape Town, Ulster University, Nazarbayev University, and the University of Sussex. And also this series is supported by UCFIET, the UK Forum on International Education and Training. Just before I begin, I should say that the lecture is being live streamed. It's also being recorded and will be uploaded, as will all the lecture series, will be uploaded to the CIE website, also will be available on YouTube, and will eventually find themselves into a new dedicated website for the peer network and openly accessible to all across the internet. From all around the world that have joined today's session. My name is Marion Novelli. I'm the director of the Centre for International Education and also the principal investigator for this new peer network that I will talk about in a few minutes. In this introductory session today, what I'm going to try to do is give you a little bit of a background to the peer network, give you a bit of introduction to the title of this lecture series, talk you through the individual sessions so you get a little bit of a flavour of both the speakers and the content of those lectures, and then really kind of drill down to some of the background into political economy of education, and specifically the political economy of education in conflict-affected contexts, which is the focus of our new network. And then you get a little bit of a flavour of both the speakers and the content of those lectures, and then really kind of drill down to some of the background into political economy of education, and specifically the political economy of education in conflict-affected contexts, which is the focus of our new network. And then I'm hoping to talk for around 30 minutes. And then after that, we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers. And again, any questions, please put them in the chat. They'll be gathered and we can engage in that in the second part of the session. So I want to give you a little bit of background to the Political Economy of Education Network. This is a new network funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council through the Global Challenges Research Fund Network Plus grant. And this is led by the Universities of Sussex, Cape Town, Nazarbayev and the University of Ulster, and will run from May 2020 to September 2023. And the aims of this network is really to strengthen critical research skills in the political economy of education analysis in contexts of conflict and crisis. And the idea is that we're trying to build two regional hubs, one in sub-Saharan Africa, based in South Africa, and one in Central Asia, based in Kazakhstan. And the idea is that over the course of this period, we will exchange knowledge and support early career researchers in these two regions and commission Southern-led research on the political economy of education in these contexts of conflict and crisis, up to a total of £800,000. And I just wanted to say that the logic of this project is really a critique, or it emerged out of a critique of the kind of Western-led research hegemony and domination in the area of education in emergencies. And what we hope this project will lead to is to make a small contribution to supporting the development of new scholars and practitioners interested in this area coming from sub-Saharan Africa and Central Asia. The leadership of this new project is Noreen Durrani from the Graduate School of Education, Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan, Azim Badruddin from the School of Education at the University of Cape Town, Kelsey Shanks from the UNESCO Centre at the University of Ulster, and myself from the Centre for International Education. And I just wanted to pay tribute here to Professor Alan Smith, who actually was the architect and the driver of our application for the GCRF peer network. But over the last months has rethought his future and decided to retire and to take retirement. And so he's pulled out of this project. And I just wanted to, spend a few moments just to say a few words about Alan at this time that he's decided to retire. Because myself and Alan have worked quite a lot over the last decade on a range of different international projects on the political economy of education in conflict contexts. And Alan has been very important in my own formative development. Alan Smith is the longest serving UNESCO chair in the United Kingdom, this was established in 1999 following the peace agreement in Northern Ireland. And he's contributed a great deal in that area to the development of integrated education and the introduction of citizenship education in Northern Ireland. His research on education, conflict and peace building has been very influential internationally. And we share a very strong interest and commitment on the need for good political economy analysis in a field that often was strong on technical discussions around education, but often failed to analyze the complex relationship between education and the politics, economics, and context of those environments. Although Alan is retiring, we hope, like many emeritus professors, some of them that I can see that are online today, he will continue to engage with us and contribute to the ongoing debates. So thank you, Alan, for encouraging us. And we hope that over the next 4 years, we can do justice to this project. So why this lecture series? Well, I think that, like many of us, the COVID-19 crisis has really started to change the way that we think about what we're working on and also the way that we work. And originally, the idea of this project was that we would run similar kinds of seminars and workshops in country in Central Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And we do hope eventually to be able to still run those. But we've had to adapt our plans. And this is really the first public event that we're organizing as part of the launch of the peer network. And I think that, like many things related to this COVID-19 issue, it's presented us with a range of challenges, but also opportunities. I've just dipped into the participant list today, but it's just so wonderful to see so many colleagues from around the world entering this lecture today and to be able to engage with those. So, in many ways, the COVID-19 crisis has been a catalyst for us to recognize and open up, actually, our engagement with colleagues around the world. So I think that this is, in a sense, an experiment in trying to broaden that network. But I also think that the lecture series on the political economy of education in times of conflict, crisis, and pandemic is also a product and a reflection of the fact that over the last 6 months, this COVID-19 crisis has really brought home to the global north what many people in the global south have experienced a great deal over the recent decades, and that is the disruption of their education. Wars, pandemics, austerity have undermined educational life chances of millions of students around the world over the last decades. And the COVID-19 phenomena in the UK itself has also revealed many of the things that wars and conflicts and pandemics have revealed in the global south, in terms of the inequalities that these issues often exacerbate. What we've seen over recent months in the UK is those increasing inequalities, those who were able to go online and those who couldn't, those who kept up and those who were left behind, those who had access to technology and the infrastructure and those that didn't. And I think that that has shown issues around private versus public education, rich versus poor, issues of gender, race, disability. They've all intersected in producing very unequal short-term experiences with long-term implications for educational life chances, educational infrastructures, teachers and students' lives. And those are many of the issues that we in the Centre for International Education and also the peer network have worked on for many years in the Global South. And during the lockdown period, a group of us in the Centre for International Education, we met weekly for discussions about the effect of the crisis. And we developed a blog that I'm linking to in this web, but I will also put a link at the end of the presentation, where we collected in much greater detail and raised some of those issues and challenges that not only affect the education system, but also the nature of research, the field of international education and development as we move forward. I just want to then, as a follow-up now, to talk for a few minutes about the type of lectures that are coming. After my introductory lecture today, next week, we're very lucky to have Prachi Srivastava from the Western University in Canada, who will be talking about the politics of COVID and education. And Prachi currently has become really active in advising and commenting on the effect of COVID-19 on education. She's been working with the T20 task force on COVID-19 that's feeding into the G20 meeting coming up on the effect of COVID on education. And she's also been very active in her own region in Ontario in raising issues and questions around the education policies that have emanated from the crisis. So Prachi will begin the lecture series really talking about some of the effects and the challenges and the issues that we all have to face as we continue to deal with the COVID-19 virus. In the lecture, in the following lecture on the 22nd of October, I'm very pleased to have my colleagues Anthony Verger and Clara Fondevilla from the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. The Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona and the JEPS group have been long-standing collaborators with myself and with the Centre for International Education, and have done some really, really interesting work on the global governance of education, and particularly on the role of education privatization over recent periods, with a strong focus on the relationship between privatization and neoliberalism. And in their lecture, they will reflect on the way that crisis, whether that be economic, political, or viral, often is an opportunity for transformation for a range of different social forces. And they will explore the way that powerful actors, both national, supranational, international agencies, and private actors have taken advantage of moments of crisis to push through radical reforms in education. This was seen in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and has also been seen in Liberia after the Ebola crisis and a long legacy of a brutal civil war. So they will be talking about, in a sense, the way crisis becomes an opportunity for powerful forces to transform education systems. On the 29th of October, our own Professor Yusuf Said from the University of Sussex will be returning to the issue of COVID-19. Again, Yusuf has been very active during this period in advising both UNESCO but also Education International on some of the effects of the COVID-19 crisis on teachers in particular, education systems more generally, and his lecture will reflect on the variety of actors and the challenges of policymaking during this period. On the 5th of November, our colleague from the Center for International Education, Nimi Hoffman, a recent recruit to the Center for International Education, will reflect on the construction and survival of an intellectual community during structural adjustment in Africa. In this lecture, Nimi will start to reflect on an earlier crisis in sub-Saharan Africa, which devastated the education system under a wide range of neoliberal reforms that came and led by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And Nimi's lecture really focuses on the capacity of African intellectuals through a range of different organizations to cope and to survive during that period and to retain their intellectual projects and intellectual dignity. On the 12th of November, Azim Badruddin and Yunus Omar, who are part of the peer network at the University of Cape Town, will lead a lecture on the political economy of education and conflict in South Africa. And in this lecture, they'll make a particular focus on the legacies of apartheid, the legacies of colonialism and neocolonialism in its impact on the education system. And they will walk us through a story of the way that the legacy of apartheid continues to cast its shadows in the educational development in South Africa, and also give us an update as to what has been going on in relation to many of the things that we've witnessed around the world on processes of decolonization of education systems and the debates therein. On the 19th of November, we move continent to a lecture from Dr. Birgül Kutan from the University of Sussex and Professor Mehmet Ur from the University of Greenwich, who will talk about academics for peace and the political economy of repression in Turkey's higher education system. And they will really recount the terrible history, recent history of the struggles of Turkish academics, many who have been imprisoned, thrown out of their jobs, silenced and censored because of their signing of a letter, which has become commonly known as the Organization for Academics for Peace, which challenged the brutal repression and bombardment of Kurdish areas in southern Turkey. And that ongoing repression continues to this date. And in that lecture, they will talk about some of the dynamics of the intersection between higher education, academics, and the crisis in Turkey, but will also reflect on the possibilities for solidarity, international and national, and some of the initiatives that have emerged out of that repression. On the 26th of November, Dr. Kelsey Shanks, who is the co-PI on the peer network with myself from the University of Ulster, will be reflecting on the politics and policy of education in Iraq. And Kelsey over the years has done some really excellent critical political economy research on the education system in Iraq. She's worked a lot hands-on in Iraq on policy making, support, consultancy, research on many of the challenges that Iraq has faced since the invasion of Iraq over a decade ago. For the following week, December the 3rd, we will switch our focus again regionally to Central Asia, but also focusing on the relationship between gender, education, conflict and crisis. Noreen has a long history, both as a colleague in the Center for International Education and more recently as a professor at the University of Nazarbayev, of doing really excellent research on the relationship between gender and conflict. And she will be presenting some of her analysis of that relationship and focusing particularly on Central Asia. And she'll be accompanied by Dr. Helen Thibault, who is a colleague at the University of Nazarbayev, who specializes in the political economy of Central Asia. And between them, they'll try to start to map out some of the educational challenges that that region faces. And finally, in the last lecture on Thursday, 10th of December, International Human Rights Day, my colleague Sean Higgins, Dr. Sean Higgins from the Center for International Education, will present on Rethinking Peace Education, a cultural political economy approach, where he will reflect on his work in Sierra Leone and in other places on the role of peace education and some of the real challenges that peace education has in conflict contexts, and also provide a critique of the way that often peace education tends to personalize and interpersonalize the issue of peace and misses the broader structural drivers of conflict. And Sean will reflect on that. So I think that between the 10 lectures, we have both a variety of geographical contexts, but also a range of different thematic areas, which are by no means complete. This is the beginning of a conversation that we hope will continue, but hopefully will provide an interesting starting point and possibility for a range of interesting debates. So now I want to just turn to the question of political economy and start to build up some of the issues and the debates that I think lie at the root of this series. I guess the question that first comes to mind is the question of why political economy. And I think in the field of political economy of education, particularly in the area of international development, there's been a revival of interest over the last 2 decades in political economy, in part through a recognition that international development policies, international development assistance, despite often having good technical policies, have not produced the outcomes that many of these agencies had hoped for. And I think there is a growing recognition that policies don't exist in isolation from the complex local, national, regional and global context within which they operate. And so there's been a growing interest and a growing industry in many ways of trying to analyze how policy and context interact. This, in a sense, for me, was one of my formative kind of understandings, which I took from the work of Roger Dale, sociologist of education, now emeritus professor at the University of Bristol, who used to talk about the difference between education politics and the politics of education. And when he talked about education politics, basically, he was talking about all those issues that are internal to the education system: pedagogy, coordination, lots of the teaching processes, and the kind of day-to-day management of education institutions, versus the politics of education, which was about trying to understand the way that education as system was embedded in a much broader societal, local, national and global environment, and that education itself was affected by those things that were coming in from the outside, but also had the potential to affect itself changes in the broader society. So it was about trying to understand both the internal issues of education, but also to understand the way that education itself is embedded within a much broader local, national and global environment that can be perhaps unpacked by good political economy analysis. And of course, political economy analysis itself is a broad array of approaches, from very narrow neoclassical economics, new institutionalism, from the political right, to a broad cultural political economy of education, reflected in a range of different authors. So it's a very broad church. Probably regardless of the ideological distinctions, there would be a recognition of the distinction or the importance of understanding the extra educational for making policy in education. But obviously the rationales, the understandings of root causes and policy solutions are very, very different according to the different strands of political economy that you adopt. And back in 2014, I, with several colleagues, was recruited to lead a critical literature review on the political economy of education in conflict-affected contexts by the Department for International Development. And in that, we reviewed the literature on the political economy of education and kind of grouped some of the critiques around this orthodox critical political economy divide. And I'm going to talk about some of those issues as we move forward. But I wanted to turn now really to a little bit of reflection of my own journey in political economy, which has not just been an intellectual journey, but it's also been a journey over the last 2 decades, from Kashmir in India to the occupied territories in Palestine, to Egypt, to Colombia, and to research in a range of parts of the world, which have, in a sense, been my practical development, which has been enriched by all of the learning that I've done of reading some of the political economy literature during that period. And I thought as an exercise during the preparation of this lecture series that I would just try to take the pictures of many of the influences in my political economy work, and to start to try to understand, you know, what were the kind of developments or what were the kind of learnings that I had as I traveled, both in a professional career, but also in an intellectual thinking. And you'll no doubt recognize many of these characters as you look at them on the screen. But like many, I started with classics of Marx and Gramsci, but I was always very interested in the political economy of development, partly because I was living in all of these different countries and trying to understand. So I've been strongly influenced by Southern development theory, the work of Walter Rodney, Steve Biko, Kwame Nkrumah, and a lot of the dependency thinking that raised a lot of issues around the North-South relationships and, you know, lie at the heart of development. But over the years, I've also recognized, you know, some of the limits of an over-determination of the economic, and have become increasingly interested in issues around culture and gender and decolonization. You know, I want to, you know, to kind of recognize that critical political economy from Marx onwards was a critique of orthodox political economy. And what it tried to do was to challenge that. And as it's challenged orthodox political economy, it's also broadened out to a much broader school. So, you know, you'll see the images here of Silvia Frederici, Judith Butler, Nancy Fraser, that have been very influential for my own understandings of gender, Boaventura de Sousa Santos, Orlando Falsborda, and others on issues around listening to the South and understanding Southern epistemologies and the need for an ecology of knowledge, and you know, the capacity of modernity to undermine diversity. And of course, scattered across those images are also very good colleagues, some very close to me, some more distant, who work on the political economy of education in different ways. Salim Valley, Gita Steiner-Hamzy, Roger Dale, Susan Robertson, and a range of other very influential scholars that have really supported my own understanding and development. But I think that, you know, when I started studying education, my own mentors always told me, don't get to education literature too quickly. Always take time to read around the broader social theory and social sciences. And I think that my own evolution has been a reflection of that. Now, there is, of course, a strong debate between orthodox and critical political economy. And in this table, I've tried to put out some of the kind of, in a sense, generalizations that emerge from the literature when we analyze the political economy literature in education. And in a sense, on the left screen, orthodox political economy, we talk about the way that, you know, it's often influenced by neoclassical, neoliberal, neo-institutional lineages. It often sees the West as an ideal type for the rest to follow. It often sees education and development problems as something internal to the country, their problem, and idealizes donors and international community as kind of neutral actors that are helping. It often treats culture, local culture, as something that should fade away as modernization occurs, and often sees resistance to educational change as kind of forms of, or evidence of, deviance. If teachers' unions challenge education policy, somehow that's a negative phenomena. It's often quite economic centric, with little focus on inequality and social justice, but is often very good at offering solutions, simple policy solutions. On the other side, critical political economy, which comes in a range of guises: Marxism, dependency theory, world systems theory, feminist theory, etc., often see the North as the problem and the local national as the solution. So in a sense, a mirror of the critique of orthodox political economy. Often overemphasizes all educational problems as exogenous, sees donors, international community as vested interests, and often critiqued in a range of ways, particularly Marxism, for lack of engagement with cultural areas. Research in critical political economy often sees resistance as legitimate in a highly unequal system and very positive towards that, and has a central focus on inequality, social justice, social exclusion. I guess the major critique of critical political economy, unlike orthodox political economy, is that it's good at critique, but often less able to offer policy solutions. And I think that that is a big challenge. Because the field of international education and development is very close to, is very much close to practice. It emerges out of the practice of the challenges of education. It's imbued with all of the agencies, international, United Nations. It's very, very linked to that policy and practice. And I think it is important to have not only good theory, but also good practice. And, you know, for me, it's that praxis, the relationship between theory and practice that really can help. So I'm very conscious of the need, not just to critique, but to offer practical solutions and practical challenges. And just to paraphrase the words of Karl Marx, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. And I think that, you know, that leads really to the last part of my lecture today, which is really reflecting on the critical political economy of education and conflict. And I just want to, you know, say a few words about that field. It really emerges in the late 1990s with a recognition that the education for all objectives, which later became the MDGs, of getting all children into schools and gender equity and a range of other objectives, were destined to fail unless they addressed the issue of those children and students that were located in conflict-affected contexts, precisely because over 50% of all of our out-of-school children were located in those places. So there was a kind of rush. It was very much agency-led. So the field itself has been very much driven by the needs of UNICEF, UNESCO, other international donors and agencies, and very policy and practically orientated. But there have been a range of, I think, interesting debates within the field, critical debates around the complexity of these issues. I think initially, when the literature began, we really thought that education was a victim of conflict or war. But I think increasingly we've recognized that education, just as much as a victim, can also be a catalyst. It can divide, create inequality, create indoctrination, drive some of the factors that underpin many contemporary conflicts. And so that kind of dynamic is best reflected in some of the debates around the two faces of education, which was initially coined by a seminal article by Bush and Saltarelli. There is also interesting debates around the power and politics of education in emergencies. Again, a field strongly dominated by powerful agencies, many of them located in the centres of global economic power, Washington, London, and northern-led. And I think that we've seen that so much more since 9/11, where there really has been a process of the militarization and the securitization of the field. Increasingly, education has become caught up in wars on terror or wars of terror, depending on how you understand those, and binaries between Western secular education, Islamic religious education, and a range of ways that education has been caught up in political debates. And I think more recently, there's been a real recognition within the field of education in emergencies, education in conflict, of the need to decenter and decolonize the field, that it's heavily dominated by academics from Western institutions, not enough diversity. And I think that is some of the real challenges of this field. Our own recent work on education and peace building really tried to get at the heart of the relationship between education and conflict, both before conflict, during conflict, and after conflict. And we worked a lot with Johan Galton's work on positive and negative peace, and really tried to understand the fact that in many contemporary conflicts, although peace agreements were signed, often the conditions, the underlying conditions and inequalities that led to conflict at the outbreak were often not redressed in the peace agreements, and this led to the recurrence of peace. And we were trying to reflect on the role of education, and in that spirit of practical solutions, which were underpinned by critical political economy analysis, we started working on trying to develop tools to analyze conflict-affected contexts, to do national analysis of the relationship between the education system and conflicts. And we developed an approach which we know as the 4Rs, which has now been used by a range of international agencies and a range of students in their own research and doctoral work on trying to analyze the relationship between education and conflict in a range of conflicts. And the first 3Rs, redistribution, reconciliation, and representation, were really drawn from the work of Nancy Fraser on her works and writings on social justice. And they really reflect the history of ordinary people's struggles for social justice, redistribution relating to the economic, recognition related to struggles around identity, whether that be gender or gay rights or disabilities, and representation related to issues around the right for people to have a say in decisions that affect them. So, you know, in a sense, we could look at this chronologically and talk about, you know, class struggles for economic justice in the 40s and 50s, struggles for identity and representation and recognition of a range of movements in the 60s and 70s, and issues around representation around the struggles for democracy and the struggles against the Soviet Union. And we link those three dimensions with issues around reconciliation, because we're functioning in conflict contexts, in conflict contexts where you're working in an environment where you need to bring communities together after war. And so issues around reconciliation are really at the heart of this. And the way that we kind of understood that was that there were tensions between redistribution, recognition, and representation, which were about the drivers, the underpinning drivers of conflict, and issues around reconciliation, which was about dealing with the legacies of conflict. How do you bring communities together after war? And we recognized that there were tensions between these two factors. And in our own work, we would hone in on the education system and look at issues around, for example, under redistribution, issues around equitable access to services, issues around the distribution geographically or gender-wise or ethnicity-wise, around resources, who gets what, why. We would look at issues around recognition in terms of identity issues, recognition of cultural diversity, and essentially the 4Is provided a way of mapping these different dimensions in order to look both at their interrelationship, but also to draw policy critique, but also policy solutions. And I think that, again, the 4Rs, I think, is not by any means a perfect tool, but I think it's been useful to raise some of these questions that we've talked about during this lecture. And I just wanted to really finish now by reading something that, a quote from something that I wrote back in 2016 of the possibilities of education and some of the challenges of political economy analysis. Our world today is riddled with anger and grievances linked to feelings of injustice and inequality. Whether perceived or real, economic, cultural or political, inequalities underpin many movements that use violence to achieve their aims. Education systems can fuel these grievances or reduce them. The state education system has its representatives and its buildings in massive urban conurbations and rural hamlets. Its reach is unique, and through that reach can play a unifying and equalizing role in redressing the complex economic, cultural, political injustices that prevail outside and inside its doors. While education cannot resolve all the inequalities outside its gates, it does not have to merely reproduce them. Instead, it can act as a beacon of inclusion, equity, justice, and tolerance, and educate a new generation of citizens committed to social justice and solidarity, while simultaneously equipping them with the knowledge and skills necessary for employment success. For this to happen, we need to go beyond seeing children as human capital and instead see them holistically in their multiple economic, cultural, political,